Probably for many years you have opened the Bible and read about King David. You have heard how he was chosen while still a shepherd, how he defeated Goliath, how he was hunted by King Saul, the wars he fought, the kingdom he established, and the Psalms traditionally attributed to him. For millions of people around the world, David is one of the most important figures in all of biblical history. But there is one question that for centuries has divided archaeologists, historians, and scholars. Did King David really exist outside the pages of the Bible? Because one thing is what a religious text claims, and something very different is finding independent historical evidence confirming that this person actually lived. And for a very long time, that was exactly the problem. There was no clear archaeological proof directly mentioning David. No inscription. No monument. No coins. No contemporary documents speaking about him. For many critics, David could have simply been a legendary figure created centuries later to give prestige to the ancient kingdom of Judah. But everything began to change in the 20th century. In 1993, a group of archaeologists was working at the archaeological site of Tel Dan in northern Israel. Among the ruins of ancient structures, they uncovered a fragment of black stone covered in Aramaic inscriptions. At first glance, it seemed like just another fragment among thousands of ancient remains discovered across the Middle East. But when experts began translating the text, they found something unexpected. The inscription mentioned a phrase that would ignite an international debate. The House of David. Those words would permanently change the discussion surrounding the historical existence of King David. The so-called Tel Dan Stele was probably written by an Aramean king around the 9th century BC. Most researchers believe the author may have been Hazael of Damascus, an enemy of the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The inscription celebrates a military victory over enemy kings. And within the text appears the reference to the House of David. This matters for several reasons. First, because this is not a biblical text. It was not written by followers of David or by Israelite priests. It was written by a political enemy. And precisely because of that, many historians consider it extremely valuable historically. Second, because it shows that less than 2 centuries after the time David supposedly lived, there already existed a dynasty publicly known by his name. In the ancient world, referring to a kingdom as the House of David implied that David was recognized as the founder of a royal line. And third, because before this discovery, some scholars believed David had never existed at all and that the entire narrative had been invented centuries later. After Tel Dan, that position began to weaken considerably. However, the debate did not end there. Because finding a reference to the House of David does not automatically mean that every biblical story about him is historically accurate. Archaeology works in a far more complex way. Today, many researchers believe David probably existed as a regional leader or king in Judah. But that does not necessarily mean he ruled over a vast empire exactly as some later narratives describe. This is where one of the biggest debates in modern biblical archaeology begins. For decades, some archaeologists argued that Jerusalem in David's time was too small and underdeveloped to have been the capital of a massive empire. According to this view, David's kingdom would have been relatively modest, a small highland kingdom with limited influence. Other researchers, however, argue that the absence of evidence does not necessarily prove that the kingdom never existed. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over more than 3,000 years. Excavating beneath a modern living city is also extremely difficult. In addition, many ancient materials simply disappear over time. There is also another major problem. The world of the 10th century BC left behind very few written records in general. Even many historically accepted rulers from that era are known only through a handful of fragmented inscriptions. And this is where many people misunderstand archaeology. Archaeology almost never works like it does in the movies. It is extremely rare to find a perfectly preserved tomb with a clear inscription saying, "Here lies King David." Most archaeological work involves reconstructing the past through incomplete fragments, broken stones, pottery remains, damaged inscriptions, and partially destroyed structures. That is why, for many historians, the Tel Dan Stele is so important. Because in a period where almost no external references to Judah exist, finding an independent inscription mentioning the House of David is extraordinarily significant. But Tel Dan is not the only piece of the puzzle. There is also another famous inscription known as the Mesha stele, discovered in the 19th century in modern-day Jordan. It was written by King Mesha of Moab and describes conflicts between Moab and Israel. Some specialists believe a damaged portion of the text may contain another reference to David or his dynasty, although this remains debated and there is no complete consensus. Even so, the possibility that multiple ancient inscriptions indirectly mention David strengthens the argument that he was not simply a fictional character invented centuries later. Interestingly, even many non-religious scholars today accept that David was probably a real historical figure. The modern discussion is no longer usually focused on whether he existed at all, but on a much more complicated question: how large was his kingdom actually? Because there is a massive difference between a historical local king and the epic image of a ruler controlling vast territories stretching from the Euphrates River to Egypt. In the ancient world, it was common for stories about great kings to become exaggerated over time. National traditions frequently transformed real leaders into nearly legendary figures. And this did not happen only in Israel. It happened in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and nearly every ancient civilization. So when historians study David today, many believe there is a genuine historical figure behind the narratives, although probably smaller and less powerful than the later traditions portray him. And yet, that does not make the story any less fascinating. Because if David truly existed, then we are talking about a man who lived approximately 3,000 years ago and whose name continued to be remembered for centuries, eventually appearing carved into stone by enemy kings. That is extraordinary. Think about it for a moment. Entire empires disappeared. Cities were destroyed. Whole languages vanished. Yet the name of David survived the collapse of kingdoms, wars, and entire civilizations. And centuries later, modern archaeologists ended up uncovering broken fragments of stone still preserving a possible trace of his existence. Perhaps we will never know exactly how much of the ancient narratives corresponds literally to history and how much belongs to traditions developed over time. But today, most researchers believe there is enough evidence to conclude that David was not simply an invented character. And for many historians, that changes the entire discussion. Because sometimes civilizations disappear, but certain names manage to survive for thousands of years.